Great. Hello, I'm Erica Young, Associate Director for Corporate Relations and Engagements for Diversity MBA Media. Thank you for joining us today. Here to deliver today's webinar, we have Dr. Rodney Lowman, President of Lowman and Richardson Consulting Psychologist, PC, and Distinguished Professor Emeritus, Organizational Psychology Programs, CSPP, Alliant International University, San Diego. As a consulting psychologist, his area of specialty includes individual and organizational assessment, crisis management, work dysfunctions, career counseling and coaching, occupational mental health, and professional ethics. Dr. Rodney Lowman also worked with a number of types of organizations, including manufacturing, scientific research, government, and educational institutions. He's also an author and editor of 13 books and monographs and over 130 peer-reviewed articles and chapters. Rodney Lowman also serves as the co-chair for Diversity MBA Business Review Board. Thank you so much this afternoon, Rodney Lowman. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you to get started.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And today we're going to be talking about managing in crisis. And I thought as we get started in this, it would be helpful to remind ourselves what is management and leadership, and then we'll talk about what's special about trying to do it in crisis situations. So I think of management as the job of making things happen, working with and through other people. It is, of course, content specific, but the underlying competencies that you have when you're functioning as a manager are pretty similar from one application to another. Essentially, we are, as managers, managing people, things, processes, resources towards specific goals. Now, when we talk about leadership, we want to add in the idea that we are taking people to a new and higher level. Leadership addresses the why, not just the what. And it's particularly important leadership functions when we are trying to manage in crisis. Now, individuals differ. There are central tendencies among managers, that is averages and what the typical person is like who is a manager, and among employees. But managers and leaders have to also understand individual differences. We're not all created the same. There are many skills that are needed to manage and lead, but today what we're talking about are the specific skill set, at least some of the skills that are needed to manage and lead in a crisis. And I will argue that crisis leadership or management requires us to manage or lead differently. Now, we're going to cover not everything in our session today, but we're going to focus on three things that I think are important in managing in crisis. First, managing emotions, both your own and those of others. Secondly, communicating accurately and often. And thirdly, taking action. So let's take each of these one at a time. And if you have questions as we go along, feel free to put them in the chat box. We'll have a couple of times where we'll pause and or hear comments. When we're in a crisis, everything, especially a major crisis, everything is disrupted. And what you know and think you know, what you're used to in management may no longer work. The ratios of rational actions and behaviors to emotional ones and managing emotional reactions have to be realigned. And also, we're in a situation in major where the connection between what you do and the outcomes that you're trying to achieve are less predictable. It's also the case that uncertainty and fear are likely to be pervasive. So I should note that many prefer not to manage in a crisis. That's not your thing, but some love it. And what is there to love about managing in crisis? One, it's easier to create change when you're in the middle of a crisis. You can more easily unite people around a common mission and common set of goals. You can also, if you do it well, you can help make the organization stronger or your department stronger when you emerge at the other side, and it's seldom boring. So I happen to be one of the people who likes managing in a crisis, and my favorite areas are startups and turnarounds. And although I've spent a lot of my career in academia, both as a psychologist and professor, I've also been a manager and leader in that and other settings. I've led a number of startups, programs, consulting firms, products, and I'm here to tell you, as you probably know, that startups always have crises. And I've also been president or acting president of 2 universities. One was about to lose its accreditation. It was on something called show cause, which is one step above having it taken away, and the finances were a disaster. And a second one, a public university whose survival was in question in the Great Recession. So I know a little bit about what these things are like in practice. Now, for many leaders, managing in a crisis creates anxiety and uncertainty, both for your employees, but also for yourself. It tends to be unpredictable. It forces us to improvise, and it often forces us to make difficult, often incredibly painful decisions. Now, for many employees, not just the managers, but for the employees, when they are in a major crisis, there tends to be massive anxiety about what to do and about job survival. It causes them not to feel safe. There's greater tension also in the work-life overlap, which we've certainly seen in the last year. It may cause some employees, at least, to spend large amounts of time not focused on goals, but rather on their anxieties and uncertainties. It may cause others to seek out commiseration, and still others to avoid the fact that they are in a major crisis. And I would say most of us look to our leaders and our managers for direction and reassurance, especially when we are in a crisis situation. Now, here's something you can do, which I would encourage you to do. We're pretty far along our current worldwide crisis, but we're not through it yet by any means. But I'd invite you to think back to January 2020, about a year ago, and think about pre-COVID, what your hopes were for that year, what your dreams were, what you thought would happen, and so forth. And then fast forward to March 2020. I'd like you to remember, as the crisis started to intrude into your location, what was your experience like as a manager? Were you anxious? Did your role change? Were the people you worked with anxious? I can share with you a little story about my own situation as COVID started to unfold. I was traveling with my wife in the Middle East, and we were in a number of different countries. And in early March, we started to get some frantic communications from some in the States who said that we should cut short our trip and come home because it was unclear what was going to happen, and others suggested we should go to Europe or the UK. Well, as it turns out, we had no ability to change our flights because you couldn't even get through to the airlines and so forth. And the went ahead with what we had planned to do. And fortunately, we're able to finish out our trip and to return home as we had originally planned. That was good because there weren't any options. And had we followed the advice of going to the UK or to Europe, we would have been in far worse shape because everything started to unravel and fall apart there more quickly even than it did in the US. And when we got back, we were very glad to be back home in the US, in California, where we live. But it has been since then just a chronic crisis situation, one that we all share and can attest to. Now, I want to talk about the ABCs of managing emotions. And I'm going to suggest to you that if you can't recognize and manage your own emotions, you will be less effective when you are managing in a crisis. And if you can't recognize and manage other people's emotions, by manage, I mean speak to, recognize, accept, you will be less effective as a manager in a crisis. Now, you don't have to be a shrink, you don't have to be a psychologist or psychiatrist, but you do need to understand why emotions need to be recognized and allowed, and ways to do that without that getting out of hand. Now, there are three things you need to know about understanding and managing emotions: affect, behavior, and cognition, A, B, C. Affect deals with people's emotional reactions. They can feel scared, nervous, upset, fearful, elated, happy. Behavior is what we do in response to those feelings. Of course, our behavior can also generate affect. And cognition is how we think about and how we make sense of things, in this case, of feelings and the behavior that we are encountering. For many of us who are managers or who have been managers and leaders, our comfort zone is more with cognition and behavior. It is less so with affect. We also want to note that emotions have a valence, typically positive or negative, and that negative emotions are harder to manage and deal with. Now, there are many idioms or dimensions of feelings. We can call people overly emotional. Conversely, some we see as overly taciturn or reserved, who never talk about their feelings. Others who very much enjoy and never stop talking about them. There are people, many, who are very uncomfortable discussing feelings. There are quiet people who have emotions, but they do not share them with others. Some are overly angry and they blame others and attack. And in a group, you will probably have a group of employees. You will have people who exemplify various ways of approaching affect and emotion, and they probably speak for others in the group. I argue that managers need to be bilingual. They need to understand the language of words, which is a strength for many managers, and they need to understand the language of feelings, which I suggest is a relative weakness for many managers. Now, you don't have to be fluent. If you study Spanish, as I've been doing for a while now, I'm far from fluent, but I can at least get by. And similarly, you don't have to be fluent in the language of feelings and emotions, but you need to have basic literacy so you'll be able to speak enough to get by. Now, using the ABCs of understanding emotions. When you're in a crisis, I think, and certainly the crisis we've been experiencing for almost a year now, you need to allow time for people to share their reactions of what they are experiencing and feeling. People are going through all kinds of craziness, all kinds of hell in their personal lives, in their work lives, etc. So having at least some time set aside in meetings and so forth to check in with people is a good idea, particularly in a crisis. When we talk about behavior, this has to do with things that we can help our employees do to manage negative emotions. Simple things can be helpful, such as discussing how people are handling their fears and anxiety. The simple technique of inhaling, holding your breath, and slowly letting it exhale, repeated a few times, can be very helpful to help people release some of their stress and anxiety. I think also in our meetings and in our in our work lives, we need to at least allow brief moments to recognize lost colleagues, lost friends and relatives, and for you as a leader to acknowledge some of your own feelings and some of your own difficulties so that people know you're in the game as well. And then finally, cognition. This is where we try to use our minds to manage negative emotions. One of the things that is often helpful in working with people as they experience negative emotions is helping them focus on what they can and can't control about the situation. None of us, likely on this call or on this podcast, are able to control when we receive the vaccines or the manufacture of vaccines, unless that happens to be the area in which you work. Um, but what can we control about our situation is helpful, and not trying to take responsibility for things we can't control is a good basic philosophy in terms of helping people with their cognition. Secondly, as a manager, it is particularly important for you to express hope and optimism for the future. Not phony hope and phony optimism, but hope and optimism to help people see at least a glimmer of a light at the end of a tunnel, particularly if an organization has been through hell and is not yet back from that. They need to know that there is something at the other side. And then thirdly, another thing is helping people in groups share ideas about how best to handle the immediate work crisis and the immediate situations that need to be dealt with, and getting people back to focusing again on things that can be controlled. It is also important, this is 101, but here's some tips we'll end this section with. Ask people how they are doing. Allow time in meetings for people to express their reactions and feelings. Listen carefully and observe carefully for both verbal and nonverbal cues that indicate people are having difficulties. Acknowledge the emotions of others, empathize with them. This can also be done at the group or team level. I imagine many people are feeling anxious or worried, for example, is a simple way to recognize what people are probably feeling. And you're not putting words into their mouth, but you're allowing that fear and anxiety to be acknowledged. Second tip, set active listening. Managers often like to talk. They like to tell. Oftentimes, especially in crisis, you can get a lot more out of people by learning how to actively listen. Sometimes it is helpful not to respond in the moment, to say, I don't know, we're working on it, we'll see, rather than trying to give an answer immediately. And then learning the power of positive reinforcement. Here's some examples of that. Thank you for sharing your reactions with us. I can better understand now what you're going through. I appreciate the effort that Joe or Joan made to get us all masked. That took a lot of work, and we are safer because of it. Thanks to the effort of the whole team, we are now better able to deliver our services virtually. Whatever you can find to praise, to reinforce people that they are acting and taking steps that are appropriate, will also improve people's reactions, help them better manage their emotion. And finally, I close this section with this, and that is know when to hold them and know when to fold them. I think at work there should be in crisis a limited opportunity for sharing feelings, but emotions should not hijack the agenda. Neither should they be ignored. But it's not that we're going to spend an hour-long meeting emoting. You know, we need to have room for that in the meeting, but then we need to go on to the business at hand that needs to get done. So I'm going to ask Kendall if we have any questions that or comments that people would like to raise before we go on to the next section.
There are no questions at this time.
Okay, well then we'll go on. The second focus that we want to talk about is the need to communicate accurately and often, an important part of leading and managing in crisis. Now, you as the leader or the manager are who your team looks to for guidance and direction for understanding. They look to see what you say and what you don't say to try to have meaning, to make meaning about an ambiguous and difficult situation. So when you communicate, you always need to consider how are your communications going to be interpreted both by what you say and what you don't. Things that people are probably thinking about but not necessarily saying are we going to be laid off? That's happened huge amount in many organizations, and particularly in certain industries such as hospitality and travel, etc. And restaurants, of course. Should I be looking for another job? Is my manager stepping up to the moment? Should I feel safe? Do I feel safe? These are not things people are necessarily going to be saying, but it's probably what they're thinking. Radio silence is not usually a good thing in a crisis, but you can also say too much. I was struck by Queen Elizabeth's speech that she gave when COVID was tearing things apart in the UK, as it still is. And she talked about, we'll see you on the other side. And she had given only one such speech in her over 50-year reign, and that was during World War II. And so that was an example where she could be very effective by not saying a lot. She wasn't out every day saying, we're going to get through this and so forth. And so it's an example of how even a small amount of communication can be helpful. Now, of course, the modality in which you communicate matters. And we're going to focus just briefly on both written and oral communication. When you are writing, like email messages, you can better control the message, but those messages are more subject to projection, and you're not going to see firsthand the reactions that people are having when they read what you say. So it has its limits, particularly in times of crisis. You need to choose your words in writing carefully, being clear, direct, and without ambiguity, because in a crisis, people are going to read all kinds of things and create all kinds of rumors if you leave ambiguity in terms of what has been communicated. It's important also, even in writing, to address feelings, but not excessively. And especially, this is true for us all the time, is that we need to not reply or send messages in haste. Getting the message just right takes time and effort. So be very careful what you say and how you say it. And I always think it's a good idea on email, since we get so many of them, to write for managers and leaders to write each email as if it were in the public eye, because it is. Now, as far as oral communication, the positive include that we're able to, as leaders, we can see both verbal and nonverbal reactions. On the other hand, it's easier to make mistakes, slips of the tongue, or to lose control. On the other hand, both positive and negatively, it's easier to speak to feelings as you see them occurring rather than not knowing that that exists. Okay, so here's my ABCs for you about communication tips. And we'll talk about each of these in turn. First of all, A, for acknowledge the fear, pain, and uncertainty associated with the crisis. B, ruthlessly factual and accurate. And C, comfort people with a vision and hope for the future. Okay. Acknowledging the fear, pain, and uncertainty, I think in general, we want to recognize what you think and what you know people are feeling. And here's some examples of that. I can only imagine what people are feeling now. Okay, you acknowledge it, you recognize you don't know every feeling people are having, but you put it on the table, you've introduced the topic. You can say, probably accurately, I suspect I suspect you are worried about the future. I know people are concerned about their health. Okay, you're recognizing in your communications, you're putting into words what the things are people are likely experiencing. Share what you have been feeling, but briefly is another idea that can be helpful. You could say things like, we are all uncertain. I know that I am. It's been difficult for me too, but I'm glad to be with you today. Those are some examples. Now, in a crisis, factual communication is both absolutely essential and absolutely difficult. We don't know everything. Things change by the moment. At one time, it was suggested by Dr. Fauci that people should not wear masks. The rest of that communication, though, was that they should not wear masks at that time because they should be staying at home. And secondly, the masks were in short supply and they were needed for the healthcare workers who were on the front line trying to deliver services to people in need. And so later, that was held against him by some because they said, well, you told us not to wear masks. Well, that's not the full thing, but it's an example of how you have to be very careful what you say, because you don't want to miscommunicate that masks were not needed. Acknowledge both what is known and what is not known. It is very important to acknowledge what you don't know. So for example, I'm sorry I can't be more specific, but we just don't know, is a far better thing to say than something like, well, I think it's going to be X, or I heard it might be Y. Be accurate, because then people will know that even if you didn't know, you didn't mislead them. Also, I'm sorry, but I don't know the answer to that question. As managers and leaders, we often don't like to say we don't know, but if you don't know, you don't know, and don't pretend you do. I will check and get back to you. It is especially important also, in the interest of being factual and accurate, that you correct your mistakes. Yesterday, when we spoke, I told you that the due date was X. I'm sorry, I was mistaken. It is Y. People will forgive you if you admit your mistakes and correct them. Don't make too many of them, however, and by acknowledging what you don't know, the second point, then you will make fewer mistakes that will come back to haunt you later. Now, one of the people that I thought was doing an exemplary job in communicating, but is now in big trouble for his miscommunications or inaccurate communications, was the governor of the state of New York, who in the peak of the conference was doing, of the COVID situation, was doing daily newscasts and developed a reputation for providing up-to-date information and the like. Now he and his associates are under huge fire because it turns out that they were factually inaccurate about what they said about some of the nursing care numbers. And they're now trying to manage a bad situation because they misspoke seemingly intentionally about it in the first time. Say it correct. When you're wrong, admit it and fix it. Now, the third point here is that we don't know what the end is going to be, but you can comfort people with at least some glimpse of what it is like on the other side. The goal of getting see you on the other side communicates implicitly that there will be another side and that there will be the opportunity to move forward. So allow at least a small glimpse of a better future. People need that. They need to have hope. And it's your job as a manager in crisis to try to communicate that sense of hope. So what are some of the things you can say? We got through this before, and we can get through this again. When this is done, we will be stronger than ever. Those are things that I think are realistic things to say, at least in certain situations, and they provide hope, which people are looking for because they've seen with their own eyes and read in the newspaper and seen on TV all kinds of things that sometimes don't suggest a great deal of hope for the future. Now, I think that in the process of comforting people with vision and hope for the future, we need to be very careful about not overpromising. If you can't say it with assurance, better not to say it at all. So for example, you might say something with the intent of providing comfort. We should be out of this mess by May. Suppose you had said that in March. Well, you would have a lot of egg on your face come May. So clearly you can't know about things that you can't control. So don't overpromise. Or we should be up and running next month. Perhaps a hotel might have said that, or a restaurant. But again, in a major crisis like what we're been in the middle of, you can't say that for sure. Better to say, I can't tell you today when we will reopen. I wish I could. Meanwhile, we have to do X, Y, and Z. So what's important about what I just said? I can't tell you today when we're gonna reopen. Okay, accurate. And you have laid the blunt truth out there. But you also said, I wish I could. I wish I could is a nice thing to say because it helps identify that you really would like it to be different, but at the same time, you're not going to give them false hope or false information. And meanwhile, let's get on with the things we need to do. Now, I do think that when you are in a crisis situation, it is important to communicate early and often, but don't be excessive about it. Choose your messages carefully. Every new message can divert attention. So if you're getting 5 emails a day from the managers or the senior leaders, that will be less impactful than if you have 1 a week or 1 a day, meaning that make the communications you have as a manager or leader count. Don't overwhelm people with them. Don't scare them with them, and make them frequent enough that you are in touch and they know you're on the case, but not so frequent that you scare people with them. I say this particularly about emails. I think emails often, for many of us, feel like it's assembly line work, and too often emails can be diluted as to their effectiveness when they are excessive. Choose your message carefully with the things that we've talked about, keeping emotions in mind, being positive about the future, and so forth. Less can be actually more, because if you get messages all the time from people, you tend to ignore them after a while. Now, any comments, questions, reactions at this point?
Uh, yes, we do have a couple of questions.
Great.
First question I would like to ask is how do you handle, or do you have tips for handling a manager that accepts your apology but doesn't move on from the situation?
That a manager who accepts your apology but keeps keeps talking about it?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, the relationship between an employee and a manager is just that. It is a relationship. And just as a relationship in your private life, you have to work at managing that. But if the person, if you did something wrong, let's say, and you apologize for it, and your boss keeps bringing it back up, I don't see an alternative to confronting that, not in an aggressive way, but to say, you know, you said you accepted my apology, and yet you keep bringing this up. What do I need to do to have you move beyond it? Is one way that you could approach that. If you let it simmer and you're mad, that's means it's moving forward on both sides. And I think you can be blunt and say, you know, if you know, what do we need to do to get beyond this? Because I don't want to work this way with you, and see what happens. And then additionally, if it's really continues after that, I think you need to confront it. I thought we said that you were not, I thought you said that you were not going to continue, but I feel like you just did, that kind of thing. Is there another?
Okay. Yes, there is another question. Um, Another question is, how do you respond when someone is perceivably frustrated or upset via email? I worry about being too overly apologetic, even if the individual's anger isn't directed towards me. There's
Yes.
also there's also a continuation to that question. Um, they continue saying that the person is particularly angry by a crisis and seeing that they may not hear them. How do they respond in a way where I can respect their emotions?
So there's an old rule that used to be, if you have more than 3 email exchanges, don't have any more, pick up the phone or whatever, go down the, well, I started to say go down the hall. I guess we can't do that these days, but talk to the person directly. I would see what was described as kind of a communication involving fear and anger, not just anger. Um, Email is a terrible venue for communicating strong emotion. First of all, strong emotions may be communicated that really weren't intended to be strong. I once responded to a text message, and I said my responses, they had like 5 different items or something, and I said my responses below are shown in caps. Well, I got a comeuppance on that use of caps, because the manager of the person who sent who got the email I had sent, and to whom that who had complained to that person's boss, took me to task because I had thought I was expressing anger by the use of caps. Well, actually, I wasn't. I was just trying to differentiate my remarks from theirs. But in any case, I learned the lesson, and I use caps rarely. I think you do have to acknowledge it. But if somebody speaks up persistently, then I think it has to be confronted directly, again, trying to deal with what their real issues are, their anger and anxiety and so forth, but not allowing that kind of expression of them to be communicated by email in a way that is broadcast to people, a lot of people, and you may have to confront that. I've been in situations in universities where, you know, you have a lot of professors and others who are used to being able to say whatever they want, where sometimes their email privileges have been moved because they were so disrespectful and problematic in terms of how they were communicating. Clearly, we don't want to have to do something like that, but at the same time, not to address the situation, both as to identifying what the problem really is, the anxiety, emotion, or something else, but at the same time, to not address the person's inappropriate behavior and the communication of that, in my opinion, would be a mistake as well. Well, listen, I'm going to move us on now. We'll have one more chat time before we stop. Okay, so we talked about managing emotions, your own and others. We talked about communicating accurately and often and ways to do that. And now we're going to talk about taking action. Now, your job as a manager, I argue, whether it's in crisis or not, but especially in crisis, is to facilitate responsible, ethical, goal-directed action. When we take action, we help people stay focused and we help them have hope. We also want to use action as a way to help people see what can and should be done at this moment. And that is, in my view, one of the most important parts of your job as a manager. The work to be done in crisis is often different than what is important in the day-to-day, meaning that you have to come up with different ways of approaching things. You have to solve different kinds of problems. But especially acting also helps you feel like you're doing something, not just sitting there being being upset and worried. And prioritizing and planfully acting is always part of what your job is as a manager. So here are my 3 tips in this last of the areas: to act quickly, decisively, and wisely, but B, to be flexible and adaptable, and C, to coach and support team members in taking action. Now, this is management basics, but it is especially important in times of crisis. This just shows that we want to think about the actions that we are proposing to take. What kind of impact do they have on the situations we're trying to address, and how much effort is required for those to be made? For example, if the effort is to acknowledge and praise people for things they are doing well, that can have impact of 10, especially if it doesn't happen much, and the effort can be 1, or not none, but 1. Now, what we want to think about in crisis is impact versus effort. And when the impact is high and the effort is low, those are things we probably want to do immediately. If the effort is high and the impact is high, we may need to get more resources to be able to do it. If the impact is low and the effort is low, we can postpone those. But if the impact is low and the effort is high, those are the kind of things, arguably, that we may want to stop doing, cease and desist. There is always risk involved in taking action, and just like any other managerial activity, we have to evaluate the probability of occurring and the impact of the risk. Is the impact high and the probability of occurring high, then that is a risk that we really need to figure out how we're going to manage that. For example, the impact of the risk of having to shut down our gym or our restaurant is extremely high, because it may mean that the company will go out of business. On the other hand, the probability of occurring, if that's high, then we better really be focused on what can we do to manage that risk, because then without doing something effectively, despite these horrible circumstances, we may not be around. So let's talk about acting quickly, decisively, and wisely, always keeping in mind your principles of how to act and how to not to act. So identify and communicate what are the most important priorities. Here are the 3 priorities we must focus on this day, this week, this month. They may be much more frequent than they are in a situation where you can plan for the long term. I recommend you always identify action steps, even when they are baby steps, what we can do immediately to get started. And also, very important to identify and manage what we should stop doing. No, we're not going to do that now, because our focus needs to be on keeping the business open. And so we can't invest a lot of money into a new venture right now. So we're going to stop doing that. We're going to focus on short-term planning. Now, additionally, designate, just as you would as a manager, but designate it in a crisis as well, who owns what, and empower people to act. John, Mary, you need to direct and coordinate ABC. I find this normally, in general times, a good approach, but especially important in times of crisis. Under promise and over deliver. Instead of saying, well, our goal is going to be to increase sales by 100%, the goal might be to limit the loss of sales to 5% or 20%, whatever. And then over deliver, our goal was to get us to 50%, we actually got to 65, is better than saying our goal was to get us to 100%, we actually got to 65. Notice how one sounds like a great success, one sounds like a great failure. And focus on things that you and your employees can do while working in uncertainty. There's so many things in a crisis you can't control. You have to focus on the things you can and help people see by doing these things, they're contributing to helping to move things along. Flexibility and adaptability are extremely important in managing in crisis. We have to make smart trade-offs among competing priorities. If we can't get both of these things done, let's make sure we do X and we'll put off doing Y. Adjust quickly and develop new plans of attack. For example, restaurants have moved to outdoor dining when they have been shut down for indoor dining. A lot of gyms have done some of that as well. In light of what we learned this morning, our new priorities are, okay, times change, circumstances change when you're in a crisis. It's come to my attention we have some untapped resources in this area, and we're going to start using those in this manner. Thirdly, collect and amplify, that is, broadcast, communicate positive messages for simple things. For example, I want to do a shout out to Belinda for the way she handled this project or this customer or whatever. Or we met last week's target and we were recognized in the executive meeting. That means a lot to people when they know that someone's watching the good things, not just the bad things. And then finally, in this area, we need to coach and support team members in taking action in a crisis. Now, part of this is connecting with individual team members, especially during times of crisis. Sheila, let's stay on after this call to quickly review some things. Barry, how can I help you with the next steps? It's important in times of crisis, and I use COVID as our case study that we are all, for better or worse, been part of. Relate on a personal level first and focus on work. I know we have a lot of actions to take on or to take, but let's check in with how people are doing. That's what I was talking about earlier about the emotions. Give people space. And doesn't take long, 5 minutes, 3 minutes, but give people space. Not everybody will want to talk. Not everybody will want to share their feelings, but the ones who do will oftentimes be speaking for the group. And it can really help them get on with work when they know that people around them, including their boss, their manager, are supportive of them. Thirdly, we want to reward action and innovation and learn from, but not punish, mistakes. So what does this mean? Well, in a crisis, you have to be innovative. What worked before won't work now. Coming up with new ideas to get you through this difficult time, that's something you want people doing, thinking about putting their energies into. Now, here are a couple of ideas. Thanks for making a run at that. What else have you thought about trying instead of, whoa, we tried that idea you suggested and it was a colossal failure. What we're trying to reward is taking action, trying things, trying to keep things going, trying to reward innovation. Here's another statement that someone as a manager can make. Can I make some suggestions? In other words, if you're going to help people be innovative and responsive, give them space and encourage them and reward them, if only with words and praise and encouragement of the effort, not necessarily the outcome. Now, we need overall to act and stay flexible. So we want to avoid what I call stress-based tunnel vision. We want to keep the bigger focus in mind, balancing strategy, which is longer term, with tactics. Tactics are more immediate. In a crisis, we have to worry more about tactics than we might normally have to do. You want to keep your principles and the purpose of why you're doing what you're doing in mind. Don't get stuck in the weeds. You, the manager, delegate the details, but be part of the process by which that happens so that there's some order and there's some clarity as to who's doing what when. And we also need, in a crisis, to balance the conceptual with the practical. We want to think big, imagine hypotheticals, but bring everyone back to reality and focus on what needs to get done now and how you're going to do it. So we have a few minutes left for questions and discussion, but to summarize, we've talked about 3 major areas that are important in managing in crisis. Identifying your own emotions and managing those, identifying the emotions and reactions and affects of your others with whom you work, and helping them to manage those and to manage those of the team. We need to become experts at carefully communication as a way to provide needed information, not misinformation, helping your communications provide encouragement and some signs of hope, even when the news is difficult. And lastly, that as managers, our job is, and leaders, our job is to get things done. And so taking action needs to be what we are all about, but we'll do it more effectively when we do it in a different way than what we sometimes do when we are working in a situation that is day-to-day routine. It works. We don't need to change it. In a crisis, day-to-day doesn't work, and we do need to change it, and we need to be sensitive to that, and we need to also understand the chaos. And the final point I'd make is, as leaders in crisis, we have to be strong for other people, but we also have to take care of ourselves and make sure that we are sensitive to our own reactions and difficulties. So we'll wrap this up with another opportunity for questions or comments on anything that we've been talking about. Any other things you'd like to suggest?
Yes, we do have a couple of last questions.
Okay.
One of the questions is, do you have any tips for identifying which 3 tasks are the most key priorities?
In a crisis, I would suggest that just asking that question is a good thing to do daily, sometimes hourly. If you're trying to run an evacuation in a hurricane, every minute counts, and what you do this minute and the next and so forth matters. When we have to make decisions as leaders in crisis, and it just has to be done, then make sure that you are convinced, at least you are convinced, that these are the right things that need to be done. And you may see things that have to be done immediately, or the boat's gonna be gone and so forth. But in general, we want the priorities to be consensually agreed upon. And when we're talking about strategic priorities, those are things that are going to take months or years more likely to get done. In a crisis, we're talking about how do we react now? And so we need to have conceptual agreement with the people we manage and with our bosses about conceptually, these are the 3 most important steps. And then when we get to tactics, it's like, what 3 things need to be done now? Maybe it's 5 things, maybe it's 20 things. But when you have those conversations with your team, then you can help sort them out. The other thing I recommend with this is a huddle or a debrief. Things are moving fast, but you still have hopefully some opportunities to stop and chat and think. So did we make the right call yesterday on priorities? Or at the end of the day, what did we not do that we should have prioritized higher? What did we focus on that we should have let go by? And that will be a learning experience, because then you can, it's dynamic. It's not something that's stable and so forth. It's really more a process we're talking about than it is something that, you fix these and then those last for not hours or days, but for months. In crisis, it's often the hours and days that we have to attend our priorities to.
Okay. Next final question is,
Okay.
if you have an overachiever on your team, how do you award a job well done to them without making the rest of the group feel underappreciated?
So that's a great question. First of all, we'd like lots of overachievers on our team, not just one. But I think one of the things that you can do is think smaller. Sometimes people who are high achievers, their achievements are really obvious and you certainly want to praise them, but you want the team to be a success. So drawing that success back to the team rather than dwelling on the individual's part of it can be helpful. But flip that around, there are many people for whom a small step and praise for a small step could be far more meaningful and impactful than somebody that is self-motivated and so forth. And so if somebody made a baby step forward, you may want to single that out. And so it's not just, gosh, Linda did an incredible job. Again, Linda, we're just so lucky to have you, and so on and so forth. What are you thinking as the rest of the team member? What a showboat. She always gets all the credit and so forth. So my immediate thoughts are praise at the team level. Even when you're praising individually, try to bring it back to the team level, because chances are it wasn't just one person that made that happen. Yes, I really want to recognize Linda's contributions, but I also want to thank Mary and Belinda and Pam and so forth, because they really made a difference in executing that strategy. Also catch people by surprise. You may notice things that are small, but bringing those to the attention of the group for the people that don't get recognized so much can really make a difference and help people see that they're really a meaningful part of the team as well. Well, Kendall, I think our time is up. It's been a great pleasure. I appreciate all your great questions and the opportunity to be with you today. I will end. This is my email address, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions we didn't get to today or you wanted to share something. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you as well, Dr. Lowman. We appreciate you. We appreciate you presenting this webinar with us, and hopefully down the line we'll have you again as a presenter again.
Okay, well, that sounds great. So good being with you. Bye,
All right.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Take care.